Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with giant lazy meatballs. That's right, if you've been craving large, oversized meatballs, but they just seem like too much work to make, well then this is the recipe for you. Right, this super simple method involves no slicing and no dicing. And with a minimum amount of effort, you're going to be enjoying meatballs that are almost as good as the real thing. And to get started, what we'll do is cut the crust off, and then crumble up 4 slices of stale bread. And this bread doesn't have to be super stale, but it does work out better if it's a little bit dry. So if you're working with fresh bread, you could pop it in the oven for a few minutes to dry it out, or even put it in the toaster for a few seconds. But either way, once we have that crumbled up into a bowl, we will add some whole milk, and then give that a nice thorough stirring with a fork. And in case you're curious in the business, what we're making here is called a slurry. And not only does this stuff help make for tender meatballs, but it's also going to help keep them nice and moist. And that's it. Once mixed, we'll simply set that aside, and we will move on to the meat. And what I'll be using is half ground pork and half ground beef. And for me, the first step to making meatballs with different kinds of meats is using 2 forks to mix it together in a bowl so that our 2 meats are fairly uniformly combined before we add the other ingredients. And by using 2 nice cold sharp forks, we are not going to be overworking the meat, which can lead to tough meatballs. And if we get in there with our big, hot, sweaty hands, there is a much greater chance of overworking the meat. So we'll take a few minutes and a few forks, and we'll combine those 2 meats together as shown, at which point we'll stop and add the rest of the ingredients, which will include some kosher salt, some freshly ground black pepper, a little bit of dried oregano, followed by some onion powder and garlic powder, which is how you're able to avoid chopping onions and garlic. We'll also do a few shakes of cayenne, at which point we can add our breadcrumb slurry. And do not let the disgusting appearance fool you. Right, this stuff is one of the keys to the whole operation. And then we'll also add a little bit of olive oil, followed by some freshly grated Parmesan cheese. And yes, of course the real stuff, Parmigiano Reggiano. We will also do some optional chopped Italian parsley before we finish up with a couple beaten eggs. At which point we'll grab our 2 forks again and give everything another mix. Oh, and the reason I said optional parsley is because I'm calling this lazy meatballs, and I promise you wouldn't have to chop and slice if you didn't want to. But that amount of parsley literally took 30 seconds. And if you have some growing in your garden, which you really should, I do think that's 30 seconds well spent. And I guess if you have it, you could use some dried parsley. Except if you do have it, it's probably like 20 years old. So maybe toss that out and forget I just said that. But anyway, no matter what you add into this, we will continue mixing with our forks until we feel like everything's evenly mixed. And then once that's been accomplished, if we're not too pressed for time, I think we should cover this and pop it in the fridge for about an hour, just to give those flavors time to mingle. And also, and maybe more importantly, so that meat is nice and cold when we go to form it. So that's what I'm going to do, and I hope you do the same. And that's it. Once chilled, we'll pull that out. And then instead of rolling these into like 10 or 12 normal-sized meatballs, we're going to take a quarter of the mixture and make 4 giant meatballs instead. And of course, we're going to dip our hands in water first, because if you only learn one thing from this video, it should be that damp hands make smooth balls. Since that little bit of water is going to prevent the meat from sticking to your fingers, which will allow you to get a very smooth, very uniform shape. And as we form our giant lazy meatballs, we will position them in some kind of roasting pan or baking dish that we've lightly greased with olive oil. And by the way, this meatball mixture is relatively soft, so don't worry if after you form the meatball that they kind of slump down a little bit. That's fine. These are just not going to stay perky in the pan, but as you'll see once baked, they're going to look amazing and more than round enough. And that's it. Once our meatballs are rolled, keeping with the lazy theme, instead of pan frying these on the stove, which is messy and takes a lot of effort, we are simply going to transfer these into the center of a 400-degree oven for about 40 to 45 minutes, or until our meatballs are beautifully browned and they look like this. And as far as doneness goes, I think we want to shoot for an internal temp of about 160 to 165. And then to finish these off, we'll go ahead and top those with our favorite tomato sauce, since I do like to finish these in the oven. Alright, of course if you want you could transfer these into a pot of sauce, but I do think this makes for a nicer presentation. Speaking of which, once those are sauced, we will top them with some mozzarella cheese. Except I'm not using mozzarella cheese. In a shocking plot twist, I'm going to use Monterey Jack, which looks and melts exactly the same, but it just has a more interesting flavor than mozzarella, which as you know is very bland. So that's what I'm going with, and you'll have to decide. I mean, you are after all the Monty Don, of which cheese you should be putting on. And that's it. I'm going to finish these up with a dusting of Parmesan, or if you wanted a pecorino, it would also be perfectly acceptable. And once our giant lazy meatballs have been sauced and cheesed, we will pop those back in the oven for about 5 minutes or so, or until they look like this. Oh yeah, big and beautiful. And then for a final touch, I finished up with a gratuitous and obligatory sprinkling of Italian parsley, since for something like this, that is just what's done. At which point my giant lazy meatballs were ready to enjoy. So I'm going to grab a fork and knife and go in for a taste. And because my wife Michelle's not around, I'm able to do this right in the pan. Or she's always telling me not to do this, because she's afraid I'm going to scratch the pan. But that's only because I do. So if you're smart, transfer this onto a plate first. But anyway, I cut a piece and took a bite. And that, my friends, was a truly great bite of meatball. All right, forget that it's giant. And forget that we use just about the laziest method ever. Despite that, the taste and the texture are that of a really, really good, high quality, properly made, properly cooked meatball. And of course, it's not going to be exactly like the more time-consuming classic method, where we're dicing and sauteing onions and garlic and then browning the meatballs in the pan, and then slowly simmering that in our sauce. But while it's not exactly that, it is very, very close. And I can't really explain why eating one giant meatball is more fun than eating 3 normal-sized meatballs, but it is. Which reminds me, do we really need to understand everything? Right? Sometimes it's just nice to turn that side of your brain off and just eat a meatball, which was amazing on its own. But of course, we're probably going to want to put that on top of spaghetti, all covered in cheese, or on rice, or potatoes, or pretty much anything else. But no matter how you enjoy your giant lazy meatballs, they really are fast and easy to make and fun to eat. And I really do hope you give them a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.